Jesus Christ, the most famous man ever to walk this planet. You'd think we'd know everything there is to know about him. But that's very far from the truth. His life is still shrouded in mystery, full of bizarre events and unanswered questions. This program sheds light on the mysteries that have intrigued Christians for centuries. The mysteries begin at the moment of Jesus' birth, on the day we now celebrate as Christmas. Most of us think the Nativity is just about joy and happiness at the birth of Jesus. But we couldn't be more wrong. Staring us in the face are signposts to something very different. So what is the dark message buried in a story we think we know so well? The Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem is said to be built on Jesus' birthplace. For centuries, hundreds of thousands of Christian pilgrims have come to pray at this sacred site. But their devotion is to a nativity story obscured and sanitized by myth and legend. The original biblical account is shockingly different. It takes us straight into the real world of the Holy Land 2,000 years ago, a land under foreign control, torn by political and religious differences. According to Luke's Gospel, the story of the Nativity begins with Joseph and Mary going to Bethlehem, where she gives birth to Jesus. The Gospel of Luke simply tells us that shepherds witnessed the birth, while the Gospel of Matthew has much more dramatic details, like the Star of Bethlehem and the wise men. Over the centuries, the deeper message of the Nativity has been plastered over with layers of romance and sentimentality.
Well, I think we've sanitized this whole thing, and we've put all these images together and come up with a nice, cutesy little picture.
The Gospel accounts are not trying to offer comfort and joy. The familiar symbols of the Nativity scene are meant to deliver a heart-stopping punch, which hits home right from the start, when the birth of Jesus is signified in the night sky. The Star of Bethlehem is one of the most famous nativity symbols. According to Matthew's Gospel, it's seen by wise men or magi from the east and leads them to Bethlehem. Some theories say it was two planets close together or a distant star going supernova. And there's another idea that ties it directly to the real message of the Gospels.
You've also got the star, which in some ways could be seen as heralding the birth of a great person, but a star could also be interpreted as a comet, and a comet was a bad omen. It usually signified a death.
The wise men were seen as the top thinkers and forecasters of their day. They knew this sign in the stars marked the birth of a new king of the Jews. But if it was a comet, then his future could be a dark one. So they follow it to Bethlehem, carrying gifts loaded with significance.
I think most people don't realize that there is any important symbolism in the gifts, the gold, the frankincense, and the myrrh.
But these aren't presents for an ordinary child. First, there is gold.
Gold is something extraordinarily valuable, and I think what it's trying to say there, Jesus is going to be a king, and this is a gift appropriate to a king.
The next is frankincense.
Frankincense, incense was often offered up to God, and so it's showing not the royalty of Jesus, but the divinity of Jesus.
But it is the significance of the third gift that's been forgotten in modern times. Myrrh. It's a plant resin used to prepare corpses for burial.
That gives the readers the indication that Jesus is going to die and that death is going to be part of the story.
So myrrh warns of death, and the earliest Christians would have picked up this crucial message. and the spectre of death is not just for the future. It hangs over the Holy Family right at that moment in the person of King Herod the Great. Herod is king of Judea, the heartland of the Jewish nation. He is also a bloodthirsty tyrant who killed his wife and 3 sons when he thought they were plotting against him. By a tragic irony, the wise men tip off Herod that the new king of the Jews has been born as they pass through Jerusalem. Matthew's Gospel describes the sadistic way Herod tries to get rid of this new rival for his throne.
And what happens is he arranges this extraordinary, ruthless, violent, unpleasant slaughter of the innocent, so that every child under the age of 2 is slaughtered.
The brutal story of Herod's massacre of the innocents is an important element of the Nativity story. But it's not what we want to hear at Christmas.
We don't want to be reminded that the birth of Jesus is somehow linked to the death of other children.
The escape of the Holy Family from Bethlehem ends Matthew's account of the Nativity. A final detail highlights the way a much darker story has been turned into a kind of fairy tale. The lamb is one of the most familiar figures in the traditional nativity scene. It's innocent, meek, and harmless. But the nativity lamb has been shorn of its true meaning.
The lamb and the sheep are symbols. Symbols because they were sacrificed, and they became the symbol of Jesus, who was going to be sacrificed as a lamb or as a sheep.
The shepherds who appear at the birth of Jesus are not in town by accident. Bethlehem was the breeding ground for lambs used in religious sacrifice, particularly during the Jewish feast of Passover. And again, this is no coincidence.
The account in John's Gospel is very clear that Jesus was crucified at exactly the same time as the first Passover lambs were slain. So that symbolism is very exact. So Christ is seen as a sacrificial lamb.
The earliest Christians who would have read or heard these nativity stories would have had no question in their mind that, in fact, this is not simply a warm, cuddly story to make you feel good on December 25th. This is the story of the birth of the Savior, and the entire point of his life, as already foreshadowed in the nativity scene itself, is that he's going to die, and that it's his death that ultimately matters.
So for centuries, sentiment and commercialism have often masked the true meaning of the nativity scene. Far from offering warmth, comfort, and reassurance, this well-known story at the heart of our Christmas celebrations is really a prophecy of Jesus' brutal death. Jesus wasn't the first religious prophet Israel had seen. But when he began preaching around the Sea of Galilee, he stunned people with the incredible acts we now call the miracles. Tragically, the miracles provided the ammunition his enemies would use to bring him down. So how did Jesus' miracles put his own life in danger? When we think of the miracles of Jesus, the stories that spring to mind are dramatic incidents like his walking on water. It's become a classic demonstration of his divine power. The same kind of power was shown in another famous miracle. This is the Church of the Multiplication in Tabgha. It stands on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee, also known as Lake Kinneret. This is where Jesus is believed to have fed the 5,000.
You know, what do we see? We see him feeding people. The 4,000 or 5,000 people sitting there, he multiplies the bread and the fish, so that there's enough for everybody.
But why would Jesus, someone with such power over nature and such a love for ordinary people, be condemned to die on the cross? The answer lies in the acts of healing that make up the bulk of Jesus' miracles. In his time, the sick and crippled are despised and rejected by the rest of society. Yet Jesus goes out of his way to help them.
By healing these people, Jesus is symbolically bringing them into the community and showing people, if only for a few moments, what it's like to be in the kingdom of God.
Some people make easy targets for discrimination, like those suffering from a disease which even today provokes fear, leprosy. In Jesus' time, leprosy is not just terrifying, it's seen as a sign of moral and religious impurity. Religious purification is so important in first century Judaism that washing rituals, similar to those still performed today, have to be carried out by Jews before they are allowed to enter a place of worship.
It was essential to purify yourself before you could then enter into the temple precinct and undertake your sacrifices. And indeed, in terms of their daily life, if you entered into a house, may have come into contact with something which was impure, then you needed to purify yourself.
Jesus takes on the whole idea of religious purification with one famous miracle described in the Gospels. Coming across a man with leprosy in a street, Jesus stops.
It's actually quite dangerous because he's risking becoming impure himself, not just contracting leprosy, which would be bad enough, but becoming ritually impure.
Jesus touches him. Jesus' touch heals the leper. But that simple touch threatens the belief system of his world. Jesus is demonstrating that even people classed as impure should not be shut out of religious life. Such revolutionary behavior at the very beginning of his time as a religious prophet means he quickly comes to the attention of those in power. Out of almost 40 miracles described in the Gospels, more than half help people who are treated as outcasts because of sickness or disability. And Jesus raises the stakes again when he dares to heal members of another group who often experience discrimination: women.
The miracles of Jesus are really going against the customs of his time. Healing lepers, touching women. So he's doing things that are not allowed at that time. And he's doing that on purpose, I think.
But there is another kind of sickness that breeds fear. Demonic possession. Everyone dreads it. By trying to bring its victims back into normal society, Jesus is not just challenging the rules, he is stepping into a dark world of fear and superstition. And he is playing with fire. People at this time blame illness and suffering not just on the will of God, but also on the work of evil demons. They were believed to be responsible for anything from minor ailments to murderous rage. But Jesus doesn't want anyone to be excluded from religious life. His chance to demonstrate this comes when he is confronted by a terrifying figure.
We have someone who had to be shackled, he had to be fettered in order to keep him under control. He was so dangerous, he was a public danger. And the only place he could live was among the tombs, so he was really cast out from human society.
To everyone in the area, the man is violent, uncontrollable, and terrifying. But on seeing Jesus, his behavior changes. The Bible accounts say that the demons inhabiting him recognize Jesus' divinity.
They know Jesus Christ very well. They know that he is the Son of God, and they're frightened of him because they know his power over them. So, of course, Christ's enemies could use these words and say, he has control over the demons, therefore he is a demon himself.
The man Jesus helps has been made impure by living among the dead and by being possessed. The miracle ends with Jesus casting the demons out of the man and into a herd of pigs grazing nearby. Driven mad, the pigs rush over a cliff to their deaths. Now Jesus has set the man free. Some people who hear the story are frightened and angry. It seemed that Jesus was just a little too familiar with the demons and their ways.
People start thinking, well, is this some kind of magic man? Is this some kind of sorcerer that's got this? Is he in league with the devil? I mean, this was one of the charges against Jesus, that he casts out demons by the prince of demons.
Reports of Jesus' miracles around Galilee have reached his home village of Nazareth, but the result is not what you'd expect. The people there are outraged that an ordinary carpenter's son is daring to challenge the religious rules that dominate their lives. And when he returns to Nazareth and dares to speak in the synagogue, Jesus finds out just how much of a risk he's been taking. The villagers form a lynch mob.
Luke tells us a story all about how Jesus is driven to the brow of the hill and they're about to throw him off the edge.
The Old Testament laid down the punishment for someone accused of preaching against religious beliefs. They must be thrown down from a high place and stoned to death.
They didn't want him in their area. He was upsetting all sorts of people.
And then a remarkable thing happens. No one dares to strike the first blow. Jesus leaves Nazareth, having escaped a horrifying death. The message of Jesus' healing miracles is revolutionary. Everyone can be part of his new kingdom of God. But religious leaders believe he is threatening the soul of the nation. And it's a threat they cannot ignore. A day of reckoning has to come. How did Jesus develop the wisdom he showed when he performed his miracles in Galilee? For some people, the answer is simple. He was the Son of God. But there are other theories that Jesus had to go out into the world and learn by experience. One centuries-old legend suggests that he went all the way to England and gained important knowledge. What is the truth behind this extraordinary claim? After their powerful description of Jesus' birth, the Gospels mention him only once more as a child, when he is 12 years old. From then until Jesus reaches 30, there is a blank. What happened in those 18 missing years? The traditional view is that as a boy, Jesus learned Joseph's trade and became a craftsman and carpenter. But it's possible he didn't simply spend his youth laboring in the tiny village of Nazareth, because Galilee at this time was no rural backwater.
I think Galilee in the first century was a place which was flourishing, especially in terms of agriculture, trade, and all sorts of other activities.
This success owed a lot to the region being under Roman occupation. Nazareth was on the doorstep of a busy town called Sepphoris, close to one of the Roman Empire's important trade routes. Sepphoris was ideally placed to give traders in Galilee the chance of reaching distant markets and raw materials.
I think that idea of small traders having access to a wider Mediterranean swim, as it were, is really something we have to hold on to when we think about the eastern provinces.
Could Sepphoris have been where Jesus met the man who is crucial to the England story, Joseph of Arimathea? Joseph only appears in the Gospels at the time of Jesus' death, when he claims the body for burial. The Gospels say that Joseph was a secret follower of Jesus and a wealthy man. And to some, the fact that he was allowed to bury Jesus suggests they could have been related. Later stories even claim that Joseph was Jesus' great uncle and that his wealth came from trading in valuable metals. Could Jesus have accompanied Joseph of Arimathea to Britain in search of tin? Traders followed shipping routes across the Mediterranean to present-day France. After an overland journey to the coast, it was only a matter of crossing the English Channel. After a long voyage, Jesus and Joseph could have set foot in the tin mining region of southwest England. Today, people like local British author Glyn Lewis are convinced that Jesus made his way to Britain and landed in what is today the county of Cornwall.
I believe that Jesus came to Cornwall along with his uncle Joseph of Arimathea, possibly more than once.
Further inland were sources of valuable metals, iron and lead. Jesus and Joseph would have had to go to a trading center to find them. A steep hill rising 500 feet above the surrounding marshes marked the location of a town which would become the focus of the legend about Jesus and Joseph in England. This is Glastonbury. This is where a whole new dimension is added to the story of Jesus in England. The area around Glastonbury was linked with an ancient pagan sect known as the Druids. Even today, people who follow Druid traditions meet on the hill that looms over the town, Glastonbury Tor. As priests, teachers and healers, Druids were important figures in ancient Britain. The story is that Jesus studied with the Druids.
The idea of Jesus studying as a young man with the Druids, for which I'm afraid there's no historical evidence, but there's this sort of memory in the medieval church. I think that is really an idea of trying to take credit for some of Jesus' spiritual power. The idea that part of what makes Jesus so great is something that he borrowed from us, from our region.
The belief that Jesus met up with the Druids may have been reinforced by ancient accounts of their skill as healers. Jesus demonstrated the importance he gave to healing the sick when he performed his miracles. Early Christian writers had no doubt that Christianity made a quick start in Britain. In the 6th century, a British monk named Gildas declared that Christianity came to Britain within 5 years of Jesus' death. And the great Christian theologian Tertullian said it had happened by the early 3rd century. Firm evidence to support their claims has yet to be found.
The traces of the earliest Christianity in Britain are really quite slim. We've got hints archaeologically, but if you really are careful about the dating, you really don't have good evidence for Christian activity archaeologically until the 4th century.
What we do know is that it was in medieval times that the legend of Jesus visiting the southwest really took off. And it all started with the writings of one man. At the beginning of the 12th century, William of Malmesbury wrote a history of Glastonbury Abbey.
Glastonbury Abbey was a really important place. It was a rich and wealthy abbey. But in order to stay that way, they really needed to keep having pilgrims coming to the abbey on pilgrimages.
In a key passage, William wrote that Jesus' disciples could have built the first church in Glastonbury. William's account ensured the abbey remained a must-see destination for pilgrims. So a few years later, the monks of the abbey went even further. This time they hit on the idea of using Joseph of Arimathea. By the 13th century, Joseph had become linked with the story of the Holy Grail. Medieval Europe was obsessed with the search for the Grail, the cup believed to have caught Jesus' blood when he was on the cross. Joseph's role at the crucifixion guaranteed him a place in the Grail story. For the monks of Glastonbury, this was too good an opportunity to miss.
Glastonbury got on top of this quite quickly. They realised that if they could claim Joseph of Arimathea, they could also claim the Holy Grail, they could also claim early Christianity, and really it would bring in monks, it would bring in pilgrims, it would bring in all sorts of people.
When Glastonbury Abbey claimed Joseph of Arimathea had come to the site of their church, the story was accepted. And this made it possible for people to believe that Jesus himself had come with Joseph. Glastonbury Abbey's brilliant marketing strategy had in the end fixed the idea of Jesus coming to Britain in the minds of the country's Christians. Despite the popular desire to link Jesus with England, the story still has to be classed as legend, not fact. We still need to account for those 18 missing years. And what about the question of how Jesus gained the knowledge that played such a crucial part in his preaching? Glyn Lewis has no doubts about the answer.
When he appears in Nazareth and Capernaum, he appears as almost as a stranger, as if people recognized him but wondered where he'd been and how had he obtained his wisdom. And I believe it's in Britain that he obtained his wisdom.
The idea that he could have gotten to Britain is a bit exaggerated, but it's not impossible.
The details of Jesus' life have become the foundation of a worldwide religion. It's no surprise that many different countries want to claim a part in his story. As for Jesus coming to Britain, perhaps the evidence is still out there, somewhere. In the Gospel accounts of the crucifixion and resurrection, one name stands out as a clear example of faith and devotion: Mary Magdalene. Yet many people today remember her only as a former prostitute. How did Mary Magdalene become the victim of such extraordinary character assassination? The biblical account of Mary provides very few details about her life. For centuries, people believed her name, Mary Magdalene, simply meant Mary came from a place called Magdala. There is an entirely different interpretation of Mary's name, that Magdalene comes from the word Migdal, meaning tower. Could this be a clue not to where Mary came from, but to her character and importance in Jesus' movement? As Jesus and the disciples travel around Galilee, they need money, food, and shelter. Luke's Gospel says that a group of women provide this vital support, and the first to be named is Mary Magdalene.
I think it's clear that she was an important member of the group.
This interpretation of Mary's name fits very well with the Gospel accounts of her role in the Jesus story. They tell of two crucial moments in the life of Mary. Matthew, Mark, and John all say that Mary stays with Jesus during the crucifixion, when all the male disciples flee. And in John, Mary is the first person, man or woman, to see the risen Christ.
This makes Mary highly significant. If it's historically true that Mary Magdalene was the first to proclaim that Jesus was raised from the dead, you could argue that Mary Magdalene started Christianity. That's big. That makes her really important.
Mary's prominent role meant that women were fully accepted in Christian communities, not merely as followers, but as leaders in their own right.
This comes as a surprise to many people who think that in the early church women were oppressed and they were silenced. But if you read our earliest Christian documents, women have a prominent place.
But gradually this prominence was worn away. As the Christian church took shape, men began to dominate its councils. And then in the late 6th century, Mary became the victim of an astonishing attack. The man responsible was one of the most important figures of the early Christian church, Pope Gregory the Great. At the end of the 6th century, there had been a series of disasters in Rome. Gregory believed the city was being punished by God. His solution was for everyone to repent their sins, but he needed a powerful symbol to inspire people. He found it in a story about a repentant prostitute in the Gospel of Luke.
He brings this figure of the repentant prostitute into the much beloved figure of Mary Magdalene. It's a stroke of genius, but it's one of the very rare moments where we really have the smoking gun of how it happened.
In a sexually charged scene of Luke's Gospel, Jesus is eating with other guests when a woman described simply as a sinner comes in. The others are outraged, but when she approaches Jesus, he makes no move to turn her away.
She cries, she wets Jesus' feet with her tears, she dries them with her hair, she anoints Jesus. And Jesus says because she is loved very much, she'll be forgiven very much. Because she's forgiven very much, she'll love very much. It's a wonderfully resonant story about the sinner coming to Jesus and repenting.
Luke doesn't identify the woman or give any details of her past. But Pope Gregory implied the sinner with her jar of ointment was actually a prostitute. And even worse, he said that this repentant prostitute was none other than Mary Magdalene herself. The smear stuck.
That view has come down to us today, of course, so that's why people think of Mary Magdalene as a prostitute.
The Western Christian Church has followed Gregory's lead in linking Mary Magdalene and the woman sinner who washed Jesus' feet with her tears.
We still tell stories about prostitutes that turn around in our culture. I mean, films like Pretty Woman, they are based on the idea that it would be fascinating to see a prostitute turn around. And so we love seeing that in the Christian story.
People have been trying to clear Mary's name for many years. In 1969, the Catholic Church at last tried to put right the wrong it had done to Mary Magdalene. It removed references to her as a public sinner. And Pope John Paul II also restored the name that acknowledges her real significance for the Christian faith. Apostle to the Apostles. To theologians, Mary Magdalene was one of Jesus' greatest and most loyal followers. But sadly, this seems to have done little to change her image as a repentant prostitute.
In the West, we've got a lot to answer for in terms of Mary's reputation.
From the moment of his birth, Jesus had been on a path that could have only one end: his death. The crucifixion is the crucial event in Jesus' story. Without it, there would be no Christianity. Jesus was accused of breaking the religious laws of his time, but the punishment for this crime was stoning to death. So why was Jesus put to death by crucifixion? This is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. It is believed to stand on the site of the crucifixion, the brutal and agonizing end to Jesus' life on earth. But for some scholars, the horror of Jesus' death was crucial to the birth of Christianity.
If Jesus had not been crucified, there never would have been Christianity.
Jesus knew he had to die on the cross. In fact, the Gospel of Matthew tells us Jesus knew exactly how things were going to play out, but he still needed to make it happen. The first step was to go to the holiest city of Israel, Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the site of the Great Temple. It dominated the city and attracted worshippers from all over the Middle East. But it was more than just a monument.
The temple is the heart of Judaism. It's as simple as that.
Jesus' miracles and teachings had challenged the ideas of religious authorities in Galilee at the risk of his life. If he had only just escaped death in the provincial north, he knew that death was certain if he dared to do the same thing at the heart of the Jewish nation.
By going to Jerusalem, he was going into the mouth of the lion.
Jesus times his journey to Jerusalem well. The great religious festival of Passover is taking place. It can be a time of tension as Jews celebrate escaping from Egypt centuries before. But Jesus makes no effort to avoid causing trouble when he heads straight to the temple. Money changers are busy as Jews from all over the known world exchange their coins for local money to pay the temple tax. This is how the temple is financed. In one of the most famous incidents in the Gospels, Jesus attacks the money changers and animal sellers inside the temple. To the temple priests, Jesus' attack on their income and rituals looks like an attempted takeover.
It is in its own way a kind of royal messianic act, claiming ownership of the temple in some sense. And of course, understandably, the temple administration, who think of it as their venue, are basically thinking, who the devil do you think you are? We're the ones that are in charge here. How dare you take this kind of action?
The priests hear that Jesus has been saying that they will be destroyed with their temple. They cannot allow this to go unpunished.
There were people throughout the history of Judaism who had predicted that the Jewish leaders were going to be destroyed and the temple were going to be destroyed. And in virtually every case we have of this, the person who made this prediction got into serious trouble. Usually was arrested, was seriously flogged, or possibly even killed.
Punishment for anyone who is believed to be attacking God is laid down in ancient texts. They must be stoned to death. And by killing the leader, any new movement will be stopped in its tracks.
Well, there were other messianic pretenders. These were all executed, sometimes with some of their followers, and it sort of snuffs the movement.
It's clear from the gospel accounts that Jesus knows he will not be taken away to some remote spot and die like a fake religious prophet. His death has to be meaningful and cannot simply be forgotten. He has to die in a public and dramatic way.
And so for the history of Christianity, it's of utmost importance precisely that Jesus was crucified. If Jesus had been smuggled out of Jerusalem by a group of Jewish zealots and had been strangled, we wouldn't have Christianity. If he had been stoned to death by a mob, we wouldn't have Christianity. Christianity is predicated precisely on Jesus being crucified by the Romans.
The last week of Jesus' life is known as the Passion. The gospel narratives of this terrible week set the stage for the final showdown. Jesus knows that many of his supporters are in the city for the Passover festival. The religious authorities will have to react to his challenge. But Jesus also knows there will be another player in his high-stakes game, Jerusalem's occupying garrison of Roman soldiers.
I suspect that when we look at the Passion narratives, we need to take at least as much account of the Roman authorities as the Jewish leaders.
Jesus had dared the temple authorities to act against him at a time of highest risks to themselves. In the explosive atmosphere of Passover, the slightest incident could cause a riot, and that would provoke an immediate and violent crackdown by Roman troops.
The Romans knew full well that Passover was an incendiary time. This was the one time of the year when the Roman governor would leave his residence in Caesarea and come with troops to Jerusalem and station them around the temple. Why? To quell any possible riots.
Jesus had put the temple priests in an impossible situation. By challenging the authority of the temple priests, Jesus presents them with a dilemma. Putting Jesus to death might lead to riots, and the Romans would simply step in and take over. The priests would be kicked out of the temple, lose their power, and Jewish independence would end. The high priest Caiaphas has to make a decision. Jesus has driven him into a corner. Even though it may lead to accusations of collaboration with the Romans, he has no choice. He decides to surrender the right to punish Jesus and hand him over to the Romans. It's a price Caiaphas thinks worth paying.
Caiaphas stands up and says, "Look, you idiots, this man has to die. It's better to sacrifice one man than the entire nation."
Priests claim that by being proclaimed a king by his followers, Jesus is trying to seize power and challenge Roman authority.
The charge against him that was preferred is that he's setting himself out to be a messianic king, Messiah in Jewish language, king in political or Roman language. So they're able to come up with a charge that translates quite readily, against which the Roman governor would have to move.
Jesus is now taken in front of the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, to answer the charges against him. As expected, Pilate has no interest in Jesus' religious message. He asks one crucial political question.
Pilate simply asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Or, "Do you call yourself the king of the Jews?" Or, "Do you really think you're the king of the Jews?" And Jesus either answered yes, or he didn't answer at all. And Pilate thought, he's a troublemaker, he should be crucified.
Jesus is found guilty and sentenced to death. The Roman form of public execution for murderers, mutineers, and political rebels is not stoning, beheading, or hanging. It is crucifixion.
Crucifixion was something which was for slaves and the worst of the worst. It was a terrible way to die, and Pontius Pilate wanted that image of his death to be retained in memories of all of those who are going to be spending Passover in Jerusalem in the year 30 CE.
We're talking here about a form of punishment which was designed to draw out the whole process, to make it as painful as possible, but also to draw in spectators to watch the whole process of a person die a humiliating death.
Jesus' death is to be a degrading public spectacle. First, he is brutally whipped and then forced to carry the heavy wooden beam of his cross through the streets. The Gospels make it clear that by his death, Jesus will be atoning for the sins of mankind. But this means he has to experience the full horror of what is to come. He even refuses the pain-killing drink that is offered to people about to be executed.
Victims usually died, as far as we can work out, by asphyxiation. You wouldn't necessarily lose a lot of blood even being nailed by hands and feet to the cross. So it was much more the process of trying to keep breathing while you are affixed in this position.
Jesus' crucifixion takes place near one of the main gates to Jerusalem, in full view of anyone entering or leaving the city. The stage was set for the birth of a new religion.
There's something about the very public nature of an execution like crucifixion that gives Christianity, for want of a better way of saying it, a kind of kickstart.
The Bible tells us that through his death, Jesus had fulfilled his mission on earth. By forcing the Jewish and Roman authorities to act against him, he had taken his message onto a very public stage. His death could not be hidden and became an inspiration for generations of Christians.
The early Christians took Jesus' crucifixion, turned it, as it were, from a great mark of shame into a kind of badge of honor, because they saw in his death the atoning sacrifice for sin.
The crucifixion is the last and most important of the mysteries that surround Jesus' story. Now it is possible to see just why the events of the last week of his life unfolded the way they did, and how it led to the creation of a worldwide religion.